Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Matt Gagel. I am the Director of Programs here at Montgomery History. We are so glad you're here with us on this beautiful Tuesday afternoon. Thanks for choosing to stay in and listen to this. Hopefully you'll be able to get outside afterwards. Before we get started, just want to go over a few quick things. First of all, again, just want to give a quick thanks to all those who have made financial contributions to Montgomery History in the recent weeks. We are only able to offer these programs because of those kind of donations, because of your financial support. Without them, we couldn't do this. So again, thank you for that, and we're very appreciative for that. If you would like to make a contribution, you can visit our website at montgomeryhistory.org and then click on the Donate Now button at the very top. It's orange on blue, so it's very bright and easy to see. You make a donation there, and we would greatly appreciate it. You will help us continue to offer free programming like this because of your donations, and we appreciate it. Next week, next Wednesday, so not next Tuesday, next Wednesday evening, we'll have the second of our four-part lecture series with Glen Echo Park. That will be next Wednesday evening at 7:30 p.m. We'll be talking about the different types of carousels, the history of the carousels at Glen Echo Park. Should be a fantastic presentation. I know you're going to love it, and we are very excited for that. I think that's all I've got at the moment. I'm sure I'll probably remember something in just a moment, but that's which is what usually happens. But with that, I'd like to introduce Jim Johnston, who's a regular. He's a member of our Speakers Bureau, and he does some fantastic research. He gave me a preview of this presentation a couple weeks ago, and let me tell you, it is fantastic, and I think you're going to love it. No pressure there, Jim, but but I think it should be great. So with that, I'll let you go ahead and take. Oh, I just remembered what I forgot to say. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A button. Those questions will come to me, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll get to as many of those as we can. We may not be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Jim. Let me stop my screen share there, and you should be good to go.
All right, thank you. I may have jumped in there a little early with talk. Thank you all for showing up. I'm going to talk about the Potomac, the river, land, and people. And this is sort of an odd little thing I put together in researching books I've done, the Yarra book I wrote, and articles I've written. I came across little bits and pieces about the Potomac River, and I thought, this really should be put together in some kind of coherent fashion. I'm not sure how coherent I am today, but I am going to talk about the river and how it's affected our lives through history. This will largely be organized chronologically, beginning as early as I can, and then move up to modern times. And I must say that when I started, I thought about, well, should I start with the Big Bang? And I thought, well, that's probably too far back. So instead, I start about 250 million years ago when Africa and Europe and North America were colliding, and you see it in this image here. And when they did that, they came together here, and in North America, it formed the Appalachian Mountains. In Europe, it formed the Scottish Highlands, and in Africa, the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. And you can if you ever look at a map or aerial photograph, I'm going to show you some as we go on, you'll see how there's this folding effect on both continents. If you take a level plane and you have two continents smashing together, it starts making this folds, and eventually you have this as being a mountain and this is a valley. And that's sort of the terrain you see in our area of North America. The Potomac itself, its watershed is on this diagram. I'm going to pretty much ignore, in fact, I'm going to ignore completely the Tidewater Potomac down here because it's just Tidewater. The part I'm interested in is from Washington on north and west. And you can see on this, the fold lines The big drainage area is the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia and the Conococheague Valley in Maryland and Pennsylvania, plus all this region of the Appalachian Mountains. I'll begin now with the earliest human history we have here that we know of is with the Native Americans. There was a small group living on Harrison Island in the Potomac. And to orient you as to where that is, here's Leesburg, Virginia. Here's Poolesville, sort of directly west of Poolesville. That's Harrison Island. And what we know about it comes from two men. We know about them, and we also know farther down the Potomac. Well, I'm sorry, I'm confusing my slides. They don't jive with my notes. These two men who explored this for the governor of Virginia, Giles Vander Rostiel and Burr Harrison, hence Harrison Island. And they wrote this in their diary. The 16th of this instance, April 1699, we set out from the inhabitants and found a good track for 5 miles. We generally kept about 1 mile from the river and about 7 or 8 miles above the sugar land. We came to a broad branch of about 50 or 60 yards wide until we came to ye fort or island. As for the number of Indians, there was at the fort about 20 men and about 20 women and about 30 children. They informed us there was some out a hunting, but we judge by their cabins there cannot be above 80 or 90 bowmen in all. And this is one of the first instances records we have of white men encountering, or Europeans encountering Indians in the upper Potomac. John Smith of Jamestown and others had explored up the Potomac as far as basically Georgetown. But this is the first time, at least that I found, that we have people from the colonies coming across Native Americans in our section of the Potomac River. And you see, they mentioned the sugar lands, and we have sugar land. We all know, I think, people in Montgomery County about sugar land in Maryland, which is this section of Montgomery County, but there's also sugar land run in Virginia, and the word sugar land is used on the south side of the river in Virginia. And according to the early explorers, the Indians gave them a little candy made from the sap of maple trees that grew in here. And hence, that's one explanation for how the word sugarland originated. It's also true that apparently the Native Americans in this area practiced a kind of slash and burn, where they would live on a piece of land a while, and then when they wanted to move, they would burn it, set it afire to burn it and clear the trees out, and then a year or two later move into that area. So they also mention, in talking about sugar lands, they also talk about the wastelands. So there were both sugar lands and wastelands along the Potomac before the Europeans settled. The other evidence we have of Native Americans is here. This is in the Potomac near Great Falls, near the Legion Bridge. These are fish weirs that they believe were left over from the Indians. And basically what you do is you go out in a canoe and you drop rocks all along here and then up into this V, and then this is upriver. So as the water moves downriver, the fish tend to congregate behind these fish weirs, and the Indians could then go out and net them or spear them to catch them. So there is that evidence of Native Americans living here. But as far as recorded history and significant history as how this river started changing things, I start with George Washington. And this is George Washington painted by Charles Wilson Peale. Washington was a colonel in the Virginia militia, and this is him in his uniform. And he was very interested in helping out the British during the French and Indian War. And so as part of that, he took a contingent of Virginia militia to explore and survey the land and see what was going on. And he went all the way up into Pennsylvania. And this is, he built a fort there, and this is the reproduction of the fort. It's called Fort Necessity, just a little south of Pittsburgh. And Washington wasn't quite the general at the, the wise military man then that he later became. And so he got trapped there. He and his men got trapped. They were completely surrounded by French and Indians. They surrendered, and the French commander let him return to Mount Vernon. But it had taken Washington months to get all the way up to Pittsburgh. They had gone overland, and you can see these trees. This is today, but the trees were about as thick then. And so the ordeal of getting up there through forest and overland up to Pittsburgh, as I said, took months. And so Washington was persuaded on the way back, he hopped into a canoe. And this is what he encountered, was the Potomac River. And this is a photograph taken last fall at Shepherdstown, West Virginia, the bridge over the river between Sharpsburg, Maryland, and Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And you can see instantly the difference Washington would have seen in the way he'd gone up the river from the way he could go down the river in a canoe, and what a major asset this was to people in Maryland and Virginia. Before I leave this photograph, I want to jump ahead at two things about this part of the river. First of all was that a man named Joseph Chapline in Sharpsburg, which is off to the left here, had the idea when they built the Capitol, when they decided to put the Capitol in Washington, D.C., he lobbied to have the Capitol put up all the way up the river into Sharpsburg, where he owned a lot of land and would have made a lot of money. But he had a good argument, which he said it's above the tidewater. So if an invasion fleet of ships come, they can't get all the way up to Sharpsburg. And indeed, when the British burned Washington in 1814, he proved prescient, at least to that extent. The other interesting thing about this photo is you see these two bridge piers here. These were the original bridges over the Potomac at Shepherdstown, and they were burned by Stonewall Jackson in 1861. I mean, he burned the bridge sort of out of spite. As a result, after the Battle of Antietam, which was in 1862, Lee and the Confederate Army got trapped on the north side of the river by high water and had trouble getting back to Virginia. Had Stonewall not burned the bridge, they could have easily have gotten back to Virginia. And the same thing happened after Gettysburg in 1863, when Robert E. Lee lost Gettysburg so badly. Again, his very decimated Confederate Army got trapped on the Maryland side of the river, and it took a number of days before they could get back to Virginia. And again, thanks to Stonewall Jackson, they were unable to use that bridge. But let me continue. That was a digression I just had. If you go up to Shepherdstown, Sharpsburg, you want to see those bridge piers and think of Stonewall Jackson. So Washington continued on down the river, and until he got to around Harper's Ferry, where he encountered these rapids. And he almost drowned here. The canoe sank, not completely, but got Washington all wet. And so he thought, well, it was the river was really nice up farther north, but down here in these rapids, it's a little dangerous. And then, of course, when he got to Great Falls, he already knew that he couldn't come down the river at Great Falls, and he had to go over on the Virginia side by foot. But the idea stuck in his head that this was a major navigation asset in the region, was the Potomac River. It had some problems. It had the Great Falls and it had rapids, but aside from that, you could get almost to Pittsburgh by water if you could somehow do it with the river. And here's how it all looks on a satellite photograph. Here's Washington, D.C. If you could go up the river to Cumberland, is sort of as far up the river as you can get with the natural waterway. But once you get to Cumberland, you're only 109 miles from Pittsburgh, where you pick up the Ohio River. And from Pittsburgh, the Ohio goes all the way down to the Mississippi, all the way to New Orleans. So this was Washington's sort of coming out in his head that, gee, this waterway has great potential to open up the entire United States by water. He turned to a man named John Ballantyne. And John Ballantyne, this is his obituary. John Ballantyne had the same idea that Washington did. And he was trying to make these rivers on the East Coast navigation inland. And this is his obituary, giving him credit for trying to do that. And on the Potomac River, especially, he had the idea of a canal. And he, in fact, talked to Washington about it. It was a bypass canal, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. It's not like the C&O Canal. This would be an in-river canal where most of the time the boats would be using the river itself as the way of transportation with just little improvements here and there. And I'll show you those. He also was very interested in, John Ballantyne was also very interested in all the minerals along the Potomac. And he built iron furnaces. And this is the product of one of the iron furnaces at the museum in Occoquan, Virginia. This is what is called a pig of iron. So if you've ever heard pig iron, this is what it is in the early days. John Ballantyne also went up to near Harper's Ferry and built a iron furnace over there along with a man named John Semple. And then they used the Antietam Iron Works on the Maryland side to forge that iron to make it purify. And so that region of the Potomac became, for a period of time, sort of the iron center of the middle Atlantic states. Now here is a real iron pig of iron that I took a picture of at another one of the furnaces in Maryland. This is probably 100 years later that they were able to make iron like this. And you could see the difference between the crude pigs that Ballantyne was working with and what they could be doing later. George Washington took such an interest in what Ballantyne was doing and what these early iron, they might call them industrialists, were doing, that Washington ordered the first arsenal built at Harper's Ferry. And this is an image of that arsenal. It is up, Harper's Ferry is up by what was then the iron making part of Maryland and Virginia. And it used the technicians from that. But still, Washington kept this dream of turning the river into a canal, into some kind of waterway. And with all this iron industry going on in Western Maryland, it became especially important to get this heavy iron downriver to Georgetown, where it could be loaded on ocean-going ships. And Washington was extremely interested in that. And so he used Ballantyne's original plan. And after the American Revolution was over, Washington created what was called the Potomac Company to build that canal. At Great Falls, they would have to use a bypass canal. But again, most of the waterway would be in the river. Just certain sections, you'd bypass it with this kind of canal. And this was what they built over on Great Falls in Virginia. I have a fear of heights, and I can imagine being in this boat, going up this where you're just towering over the water. And if you go over there today to Great Falls Park in Virginia, you can still see the cut from the Potomac Canal, and you can still see all of the Potomac Bypass Canal that went around Great Falls. And that was Washington's plan. Before the canal got started, he became president, and so he had to get out of the business, but he started all of this. And I'll get into that in just a second. You get up here to our part of the river. This is Seneca Rapids. And again, you have the problem of not being able to take a boat up and down the river here because of the rocks. And so the Potomac Company built on the Virginia side. This is the river right here, but they just improved a little section of the river, and it's still there. This is a photograph I took a few months ago. It's still there, this little section of the river where you could take a canal boat, either up or down the river. You could either, even if you wanted to, put a horse or mule with a rope and tow up or down the river. Most of the commerce, though, went downriver because of it, for the obvious reason it's hard to go up against the river flow. At this part of the canal on the Virginia side, of the river on the Virginia side, is what everyone calls Washington's Canal. And that is where the Potomac Company built a lock. And this is an in-river lock, also called a sluice lock. And the way this would work, a boat is going to come downriver. There was a gate here, somewhere here. You'd close the gate, and this area would fill up like a bathtub. The boat would come in here. You'd open the gate, and the boat goes shooting out. And that was their technology at the time. And I'm going to get to the technology of the C&O Canal in a bit. But this is a sluice canal. You can still see this if you go over onto the Virginia side. And by the way, there are notes accompanying this that Matt is going to post on the website with any sort of where can you go to see these things and what am I talking about? So there will be a handout. This is the sluice canal on the Virginia side. And it was at this point that George Washington had this idea, this is 1784, and he can see all of this in his head. And so he started getting a corporation formed in both Maryland and Virginia to make this canal. And he needed approval from the Maryland legislature. He got that. Needed approval from the Virginia legislature to create the corporation. He got that. That took him about a year. The next thing he had to do was to get permission to build things like this works in the river, to build that canal in Great Falls. So the Articles of Confederation said he needed approval of the two states. Anytime you used a waterway or anything that went between two states, you needed a compact between the states. So Washington then started to work on getting that kind of approval of the two states together. And he called them out to Mount Vernon and said, delegates from Virginia and Maryland, and said, okay, let's work together and get this approved. And they did. And it was called the Mount Vernon Compact. They authorized Washington to do all this improvements in this river. But then they said, this is sort of really was a tough thing to do. This is an awkward way to go about running a country. Let's have a convention and talk about this. And so they had a convention over in Annapolis it was called the Annapolis Convention, but not many people showed up. And so they didn't get any business done. And so they said, okay, we're going to have a convention of all the states and really get down to serious business. And that convention was held in Philadelphia. And when it was finished, they wrote the Constitution. So in this sense, the Constitution came from George Washington's attempt to improve the Potomac River. When they finished the canal, after Washington had been president and he had passed away before this Potomac Canal got finished, and when it was finished, you could take a boat all the way up to Williamsport, Maryland, and this is a Google image of it. This is Williamsport, down the Potomac in Williamsport. And you could take a boat all the way from here down to Georgetown, more or less, with safety. This little squiggly thing is called the Conococheague Creek. It means twisted creek in the Indian language. And the important thing there for what people really wanted to get from Conococheague Valley, because it went into Pennsylvania where my ancestors, the Scotch-Irish, lived, and they made whiskey. So the first cargo that came down the Potomac River was a barge loaded with whiskey from Pennsylvania, made by the Scotch-Irish who were up in the mountains of Pennsylvania. So, we're starting to see now the river being used for commerce, and this was what Washington had in mind. The other thing you may not know about the Potomac Canal was that the superintendent of that canal was a man named George Pointer, who had been born a slave. He started working on building the canal. They built a bypass here around Little Falls, and he started working there, and he made so much money he bought his freedom. And then he was so talented that he rose up to next being a captain of a barge that was running up and down the river around Great Falls. And then finally they made him superintendent of the canal, sort of an engineer, maintenance supervisor of the canal. And so the early Potomac Canal supervisor was an African-American former slave named George Pointer. He had a house along the river. This is the Maryland-Virginia line. So it was just a little bit into Montgomery County. But this canal didn't work. The locks clogged, the river levels rose and fell. It was never consistent, safe navigation. The debris cluttered the river. So that's when they turned to what was called a bypass canal, what we know of as the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. And this is how it looks today. This is at Great Falls. And this is how a bypass canal works. Let's say you're bringing a boat up the river, you pull in here, they close this part of the lock. This fills up with water. And then you can sail out, you can go out the north side, upriver side. And coming down, the same thing would happen. They would close these gates again. You'd come in, it would fill up with water. You then close these gates and you come out going downriver. So this was the bypass canal, and it was a vast improvement on the Potomac Canal because, for one thing, boats could go both directions. For another thing, they didn't have to fight the flow of the river. They could have mules on the towpath to pull them along. But I've called this in the announcement of the first interstate waterway. And one of the things it had was what I would prefer to call as clover leaves. That is, whenever the river came to another creek, or whenever the canal came to a creek where you might have commerce coming down that creek, there were also canals and commerce going down those creeks. And so the barges from those creeks would have to get into the C&O Canal. And the prime example is the cloverleaf here in Montgomery County. This is Montgomery County on the right side. This is Loudoun County over here. This is Goose Creek. In Goose Creek in Virginia, the people decided that the C&O Canal was so successful, they were going to convert this into an in-river canal or an in-creek canal. And so they tried to improve this because there were 7 flour mills in Loudoun County, and they wanted to get their commerce down to Georgetown. So the idea would be you'd come down here in a barge, you'd cross the river, and you get into the C&O Canal, which is over here. The way they did this is a photograph I took earlier this winter up by Edwards Ferry. This is where the cloverleaf is, at Edwards Ferry. That's Goose Creek Canal. So the barge would come out here, cross the river, come over here to the Maryland side, and here's what is more or less a equivalent of a cloverleaf. This is the on-ramp to get into the C&O Canal from the river. Actually, the Goose Creek Canal failed and they never were able to do much with it, but this works, is still there, a way to get from the river into the C&O Canal. There was a Maryland family. People who know about Sugar Land know the Allnutt family, which is an old Maryland family, and they've lived in the Sugar Land area for many years, many centuries. But one, Robert Gilmore Allnutt, according to this log of boats that were on the canal, in May 19th, 1853, he took the George Cass and he docked it, kept it at Goose Creek in Loudoun County. And his whole idea was to use that commerce to go from Loudoun County all the way to Georgetown. He could take that flour from Loudoun County and take it down to Georgetown. You know, a wagon, I did the math on this, a wagon, if you try to take a wagon load of wheat or flour from Loudoun County down to Georgetown, a wagon can hold maybe a 1,000 pounds, at best 2,000 pounds. A canal boat can hold 200,000 pounds. So it can hold about 100 times more wheat or flour than could wagons. So Allnutt had this brilliant idea that he was going to make a lot of money bringing that downriver. And again, this is a Maryland family who goes over to Virginia to make money. There are other Maryland families that, there's a lot of commerce between the two. This is an 1853 map showing Gasaway Island and Low Island. And here is a photograph from Montgomery History's photograph collection of Tommy Lowe. This is taken on the Maryland side. Tommy Lowe, a descendant of the Lowes, and Alice Waters Gasaway. I guess this is probably around 1920 or so, sitting on at the C&O Canal, so that these families who were Maryland families or Virginia families, they would move back and forth across the river over the generations. The Lowe Island, for example, that was Enoch Lowe from Frederick County originally, who was governor of Maryland for a while in the 1850s. The other role that, of course, the canal was a major factor along the river. It got its water from the river, but they had these canal boats, and this made a huge improvement. And one was in passenger service. In the library, again, the Montgomery History's library, is this notes from Alice Darby, written in 1942, about what it was like. One thing we looked forward to for weeks was a trip to Washington or Georgetown to buy new dresses and to see our friends. And she's writing from the Seneca area in Montgomery County. There were two ways we could make the trip: drive all the way with a horse and buggy, or go on the Packet, a little boat which made the round trip from Georgetown to Point of Rocks frequently on the canal. And the Packet boat is one that goes on regular schedule. It took nearly all day to go from Seneca to Georgetown, but the Packet might vary its schedule to the extent of several hours, which would prove quite annoying to the passengers at Seneca. So if you can put yourself back in the 19th century or the early 20th century, and you're living all the way out in Seneca, Sugarland region of Montgomery County, you could go into Georgetown by boat for a day trip, for a buying excursion in Georgetown. So these were the kinds of differences the canal and the river were making to life around the river. Also up in Seneca, as I think everybody knows, is Seneca Quarry. Garrett Peck wrote a wonderful book about the river and included a lot about Seneca Quarry. It was an interesting thing. It's again at where it says it. It's where it says at Seneca. It hired both African Americans and Caucasians, whites, to work. It was an equal employment, equal opportunity employer, although it's extremely dangerous work. But there are a number of quarries in Montgomery County, again, that were open to African American workers, and it was a pretty well-paying job. And the family names of people from Seneca are also show up around the quarries in other parts of Montgomery County, so that these men moved around. The other thing that came down the river via the canal was coal. This is a picture taken obviously in 20th century, modern coal cars, but these canal boats are loaded with coal. And the difference that made was huge, because before they had coal coming down the river, houses were heated in the winter with firewood. And the Washington, D.C. area, all the areas we know today, were denuded of trees. They were bare because people were burning firewood. And so when the canal finally came along, and the whole idea of a canal or using the river, you could bring these heavy things like coal down the river cheaply to improve life in the Washington area. The same was true of lime. These are the lime kilns around Shepherdstown, and lime is used to make cement. And so without being able to bring the lime down the river, a lot of the buildings in Washington could never have been built. So we were heating our homes, people were heating their homes and building their mortar and other buildings with cement from the lime deposits along the Potomac River. The Civil War comes. I'm moving this through history. The Civil War comes. There's a thing called the Great Appalachian Valley. It runs from Lynchburg, Virginia, up to past Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, about 250 miles. It's the Shenandoah River Valley in Virginia. And as I've said before, the Conococheague Valley in Pennsylvania. It's also called the Cumberland Valley there. And this is during the Civil War. This was the invasion route the South used to invade the North. Stonewall Jackson for the Confederates cleared the valley of Yankees, and then Antietam took place in the Great Appalachian Valley because that's where Lee wanted to be. He went on up here during the Battle of Gettysburg. He just traveled up the Great Appalachian Valley to Gettysburg, and was the invasion route to the north. And again, it's part of the Potomac River basin or watershed. But focusing now specifically on our section of the river during the Civil War, the river served as a fort. It was a huge obstacle. Armies can't cross rivers under fire. And so it served the same purpose as a giant trench or a castle wall. You could ford it at the mouth of Monocacy. There was White's Ford up by Dickerson that Robert E. Lee used on the way to Antietam. There was a ferry at Edwards Ferry. White's Ferry today was not there in the Civil War, was not a crossing point. And down here towards Washington was Rouser's Ford or Muddy Branch Ford, where the river could also be forded. Once you got across, if you went from Virginia into Maryland, once you got into Maryland here, you were only 20 miles from Georgetown. So it was vitally important for the Union to protect this entire line from large armies crossing. They obviously failed when Lee crossed at White's Ford, but this was all guarded during the Civil War. Initially, they just posted troops at guard points like Muddy Branch Ford or Edwards Ferry. But later in the war, they moved the troops back to Poolesville and had them patrol the river by horseback or walk along the river. There was in Maryland the White family, Elijah White, who was born here at Stony Castle outside Poolesville. And he was an interesting figure, one of the more colorful figures. Here he is. He was a partisan. He fought for the Confederacy, not in part of the Confederate Army. He wore Confederate Army uniform when he was a soldier, but otherwise he would change into civilian clothes. These women, two or three of them, are his sisters who were also helping him. He had a small band of partisans called the Comanches because of their war whoops, who bedeviled the Union forces all along the river. He's a Marylander. I don't want to paint him in a good light because he was a racist. He went out to Kansas to fight John Brown and the other people to keep Kansas a slave state. And he himself wrote, or they mentioned, that when the war started, he had moved over to Leesburg by that time. He would go down to the river because he knew that runaway slaves would try to cross at night. And so he'd go down the river trying to shoot them when they'd cross into Maryland. So he's not a great guy, but he's a colorful figure that goes from Maryland to Virginia. After the war, he became a respected citizen and became president of the Bank of Leesburg. I think that may be a diamond stick pin in his tie. White's Ferry today was named after him because it failed and the bank had a loan. It foreclosed the loan and ended up owning the ferry and named it after him. He's president of the bank. He built this building in Leesburg, the Bank of Leesburg. It's a great place. I've been there for breakfast at the Lightfoot Restaurant. If you go inside, it's a 19th century bank converted into a restaurant. You can see the teller cage still there. And old Elijah White and the Comanches were named in the movie Alvarez Kelly. Not a very good movie. Great cast with William Holden and Richard Widmark about the Comanches. I don't know because I couldn't watch the whole movie, but it may mention Elijah White. And then one of the things that really struck my fancy was I was reading a newspaper article and discovered that in 1894, Elijah White announced that Belle Boyd would come and visit Leesburg. And this is Belle Boyd. She was from Martinsburg, West Virginia. She was somewhat of a spy for the Confederacy. But after the war, I think she got hard up for money. She divorced her husband, and I think she needed money. So she would tour around the mid Atlantic region, giving talks as the Confederate spy. And I gather she must have put together this uniform to dramatize her talks. And I noticed that, as I said, because old Elijah White had her come to Leesburg and give a talk. Spent a couple of days there and giving talks in Leesburg. This old Confederate sense. This was a map of Poolesville during the Civil War where those troops were encamped. This actually is south. They've got the map reversed. And this is a photograph of the Union encampment at Poolesville. A lot of the things that Montgomery history has done in the past is to try to make events in Montgomery County somehow relate to the grand events in the Civil War. And I think people who've done that overreach because, there were not grand events in Montgomery County. It was like a castle. It was like a fort. It protected Washington. And it's best shown in this poem, The Picket Guard, that was turned into All Quiet Along the Potomac Tonight by Elizabeth Beers. And this is part of it. All quiet along the Potomac, they say, except now and then a stray picket is shot as he walks on his beat to and fro by a rifleman hid in the thicket. 'Tis nothing. A private or two now and then will not count in the news of the battle. Not an officer lost, only one of the men moaning out all alone the death rattle. All quiet along the Potomac tonight. Hark, was it the night wind that rustled the leaves? Was it moonlight so wonderfully flashing? It looks like a rifle. Ah, Mary, goodbye. And the lifeblood is ebbing and splashing. All quiet along the Potomac tonight. No sound save the rush of the river, while soft falls the dew on the face of the dead. The pickets off duty forever. All quiet along the Potomac tonight. So that's what it was like in Montgomery County. And then moving on into the 20th century, in 1920, this was announced. They were going to finally make the Potomac River into Washington's dream. It would be navigable all the way to the Ohio. They were going to blast through the mountains. They were going to cut a channel down the middle of the river to solve all the problems. That didn't happen, but that would have brought into play Washington's full dream of going from Georgetown all the way up and down to New Orleans by water. As I wrap up here, I'm going to focus specifically on Montgomery County, the stretch between the Legion Bridge and Dickerson generally. Ralph Buglass gave me this idea. Montgomery County has the agricultural preserve, and you can see it on this satellite photo. Here's the river here, and you can see the difference between Montgomery County and Fairfax and Loudoun County that are developed, and Montgomery County has kept the land as it pretty much was from, say, the 18th century on with farmland. We've also turned the river no longer into navigation. This is the aqueduct at Great Falls, bringing water in from the river for people in Montgomery County to drink and use. It's one of the sources of our water. It's also for recreation. Penfield Lock or Lock 22. Grover Cleveland went up there to fish. People still go up there today to fish. This wonderful inn is gone, of course. And in the 1950s, Chief Justice William O. Douglas, a former senator from Oregon, decided that we needed to take the C&O Canal and really make it a recreation area back to nature. And he is a pioneer in doing that for us today. And then in 1945, though, the proposal was, World War II was over, they were going to dam the Potomac and use it for hydropower. And it says here, they would have affected drainage areas of 11,000 square miles. There would be dams at River Bend, which is on the Virginia side, opposite Montgomery County, and Chain Bridge and at dam number 2 or Violet's Lock. But fortunately, that didn't happen. And so today, it is still a recreation area. The other thing, that traces we have along the river in Africa are the little African American communities that followed the river as the agriculture moved up the river. That was rich land for tobacco and other things that were where slavery was used. And so today, after the Civil War, those little pockets of former slaves settled in communities and around churches. Macedonia Baptist Church on River Road, Gibson Grove, these are all African American communities. Gibson Grove Church on Seven Locks, Scotland on Seven Locks. West of Poolesville is Tobytown. West of there is Seneca, which got an African American community. St. Paul's Church at Sugarland, where Gwen Reese has done such a fantastic job with its history. Jerusalem, north of Poolesville. Warren Church out by the Potomac, west of Poolesville. There actually was a slave pen run by George Gebhardt right here in Frederick County. And then as you move on to Frederick County, Sunnyside had a large African-American community. And then in my research, Yarrowsburg and Mount Moriah Church there in Washington County. And some of those buildings are still around. This is Mount Moriah on River Road, Gibson Grove on Seven Locks, Scotland on Seven Locks. Both of these are unoccupied. Scotland was heavily damaged by a flood several years ago, and that building's unusable so far. This is the church at Seneca. It's there. This is when St. Paul's in Sugarland and Warren Church. These two churches were built by the same carpenter, and you can they're exactly the like, except a little bit for the top. And then Mount Moriah Church up in Yarrowsburg. And I will give again the movie Philomena used a couple of scenes from St. Paul's Church in Sugarland. The rich white families did the same thing up the river. This is the Bell Washington House in Georgetown, also better known as the Catherine Graham's house, when the Grahams owned it for a while. It was built by Thomas Bell, the mayor of Georgetown, and then inherited by his son-in-law, Lewis William Washington, who married Bell's daughter. This is Bel Air up at near Harper's Ferry. Again, this was Thomas Bell's house and then became Lewis William Washington's house, his son-in-law's house. This was where Lewis William Washington was living when John Brown captured him taking the arsenal at Harper's Ferry and held him hostage. In Georgetown, Tudor Place, built largely by Thomas Peters. And then in Seneca, Montevideo, which was the Peters also owned. And they also owned Seneca Quarry there. In the 1960s, Drew Pearson on the left was a famous journalist. He was a muckraker, but he was sort of the whistleblower's journalist where you take stories. And so he made a lot of money and he moved out for near Potomac. And you can go out there today and see Merry-Go-Round Farm, which was the farm he owned. It was named after his column, the column he ran in the syndicated column. I love it. There's Lovey Lane and Dallin Court, which he and his wife apparently would use those terms of endearment for each other. You can note it by the silo there on River Road. And the Belmont sign belonged to the Bell family that owned Yarrow Mammoth. But in the river, there are the egrets, white egrets. This is Seneca Rapids, beautiful, pristine, go back to nature. This is Seneca Rapids again, what's left of dam number 2, and this is called Seneca Pool, a quiet area up by Lock 23. And across from that is Trump National Golf Course. I took this picture from Trump National one day. There's an eagle in the river. This is the aqueduct at Riley's Lock. There's Riley's house, and there's a crew boat on the river. This is the Bretton Woods Recreation Area on the Montgomery side, same area of the river. Beautiful, beautiful scenery. But of course, there is this today, the American Legion Bridge, But if you get off that, as I've urged you in this talk, and walk along the river, here are some puzzles still left. My friend Barbara Brown, who is a canoeist and goes in the river, took this picture and let me use it. It's a big sandstone block from Seneca Quarry sitting in the middle of the Seneca Rapids. We have no idea how it got there. There's no way a big rock like this could get in that location unless they were trying to carry it across the river on a boat that sank. On Lowe's Island, where the Trump Golf Course is, there's these foundation stones right by the river. We have no idea why these are there or why this bridge is there. This is a modern culvert bridge, but this is a single piece of stone that obviously was an old stone bridge that someone built there on Lowe's Island. And with that, I've gone through the Potomac, the river, the land, and people. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do.
Okay. This is a great presentation there, Jim. We've definitely gotten a few questions that have come in here. Someone mentions that they attended your talk on Yarrow earlier this year and read the book, and that they highly recommend it to everyone. So,
well,
a little plug there for your other work. Someone says, didn't the Potomac Canal have locks as well?
The Potomac Canal only had locks in the sense of like the Seminole Canal around Great Falls, and you can still see the remnants of those locks.
Okay. Again, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A button. We'll get to as many as we can here. Someone asks, any idea how old the Potomac River is geologically? How long has it followed roughly its current path through the Piedmont?
That's an excellent question. I don't know the answer.
Okay.
I won't take it.
A viewer mentions Conrad's Ferry was used during the Civil War. Elijah White bought the ferry in 1871 and named the ferry after himself. That's what they...
No, Conrad's Ferry was farther up the river. It was up by where White's Ford is. It was closer to White's Ford.
Okay.
What we call White's Ferry today was not a ferry until after the Civil War.
Okay.
I think.
Okay. I have no other comments on that because I don't know enough about either ferry. Okay.
Well, I will add this. That in my research, I've done an article on the Civil War crossings of the fords, the ways you can ford the river, and I found out that people were calling the same place by different names, and it's mind-boggling trying to figure out what any of these places were. Oftentimes there were two names and they were treated as two different places, but they were the same place.
Okay. Claudia mentions that there is a stained glass window in a Leesburg church, which she believes is St. Thomas, that commemorates Elijah White.
Undoubtedly true. He was a major figure in Leesburg. Not one of my favorite people, but
he has some history. Yeah. Clarence asks, how did you get interested in the history of the Potomac River? Was Rouser's Ford involved?
Thank you for asking, Clarence. The Rouser's Ford was involved in part. That's what really interested me. Rouser's Ford was where Jeb Stuart crossed the Potomac during the Civil War with 5,000 cavalry on the way to Gettysburg. And there is a great debate that I've initiated that they have all the signs in the wrong place. But that in part caused me to master certainly the river in this part in Montgomery County area.
Okay. LC asks, what jurisdiction owns or controls the river today in terms of things like water quality, usage, development, intake, and water supply?
The river boundary was established as the Virginia shoreline back before in the Articles of Confederation. They have sued repeatedly. Virginia and Maryland have sued each other repeatedly over who owns the water, who can draw the water out. I've read those Supreme Court cases, and some of that I profess not to know a precise answer. But basically the judges of it because everybody sues to get it. Both Maryland and Virginia take water out.
Okay. Judy Wells mentions that she has a little bit of additional information. So I'm going to send her your contact info. I think that will be helpful for future presentations of that. Let's see, we did that one. Okay, so and also another lady mentions that she has some history of the pollution of the Potomac River. So I think this presentation is going to keep getting longer here, which is great. Nancy, the best way to get a hold of Jim is if Jim could provide his contact info there.
It's james.h.johnston@gmail.com.
And you can certainly get in touch with him about that if you have further questions. Someone asks, are there any photographs or maps of George Peters' Bull Run Quarry in Seneca?
Repeat that.
So,
Seneca, I showed a picture of the Seneca Quarry, but George Washington's Bull Run.
Yeah, I'm not exact. It must be George Washington. I'm not exactly sure. It literally just says George Peters' Bull Run Quarry in Seneca.
George Peters, the Seneca Quarry was the quarry that the Peters family owned. George Peters is not a name that registers with me.
Okay. I apologize.
I'd be interested in sending me the information. I'd like to look at it.
Okay. Jean asks, are there any maps of how far the Seneca sandstone quarry extended? You can see a stone wall edge on the north side of the canal upstream from the Riley's Lock aqueduct.
I think all of that is filled in with water now. So there are two water areas there. One is a reservoir for the canal, but I think the quarry itself is now just filled in with water. I've not wanted to march around there.
Okay. Gene, I'm not aware of any maps of that particular quarry. Jim, are you aware of any?
Well, Garrett Peck's book, I don't know whether but his book is sort of the best work I know of on the quarry. I mean, it's only a part of his book, but he does a lot of work on the quarry there. And he's on the Speakers Bureau.
Okay. Brian has chimed in here with a little update here. He says, George Peter owned another quarry next to the other Peter quarry in Seneca. So it must have just been another competing quarry.
If you look, there's an 1853 map. I think it's the Yardley map that you get at Library of Congress's online of Northern Virginia. You can see all the minerals, because not all of them, but they marked a lot of the mineral deposits. There were iron mines over in Fairfax County, but I think they probably only lasted like 6 months worth of work. There were copper deposits up in Loudoun County. There's gold deposits up by Great Falls on the Maryland side. So there were all these little mineral deposits. I think the Seneca quarry with that sandstone was the big
one. Excuse me. Judy also mentions that the Potomac River is a source of water for the Washington Aqueduct, but not a drop of it goes to Montgomery County. So a little bit of, as you mentioned that the lawsuits regarding water control there. Someone asks, the C&O Canal used mules walking on the towpath for moving barge, but for Potomac River boats transport, how were the barges powered?
Good question. And that most of them went downriver for that reason, but they would have poles, and you would, get men on both sides of the boat, put the pole down and hit bottom, and then walk backward in the boat and pull it up the river. That's fairly good way to do it unless you're in a big current like the Seneca Rapids, and then that's not an efficient way, but that's the only way to get it up the river. You might throw a line and have someone pull you up the river with a horse around, but again, they didn't really do that. At Great Falls, I'm told there are loops, iron loops in the wall of Mather Gorge. And they would put ropes through those loops and then pull the boat up through those loops. But that was the other way. But again, that's why the Potomac Canal didn't work very well.
Okay. Carolyn asks, do you know what groups or language groups of Native Americans lived along the Potomac River?
Stephen Potter did a wonderful presentation at the history conference, and I think that is still online.
It is. It would be part of the, if you purchase, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
no, go ahead.
If you purchase the premier $75 ticket for the history conference, you should have access to those. If you did not, you can reach out to me. My email is mgagle, MGAGLE, at montgomeryhistory.org, and we can help you purchase access to those. So go ahead.
And as I remember his lecture, he said it's the Algonquian language, and they were Algonquin Indians. But he does a very good job in that lecture of laying out all the nuances that you have to master.
Okay. A follow-up question to the boats. What happened to the empty boats after arriving in DC?
I wondered about that too. What at the time, what they would do, and this happened on the Mississippi too, they took the boats apart and sold the lumber. They were cheap flat bottom boats, and the ones that went downriver were cheap flat bottom boats. And once they got to the destination, wherever, whether it's the Potomac or anywhere else, take the boats apart and sell the lumber to build houses with.
Okay. So a couple of questions have come up about the origin of the name of Potomac, or what is the translation of that? How did that name get applied to the town or area of Potomac?
I think that's an Indian tribe. I think the Potomacs were one of the tribes that were living along the river, but not necessarily in this region, because Potomac runs all the way down to the Chesapeake Bay, and I think the tribes may have been living somewhere along that area.
Okay. Someone mentions that Eric Ledbetter at Seneca Creek State Park would be a great source for the Seneca Quarry info. So I don't have a contact email for him, but I'm sure he would be. I'm going to reach out to him because maybe he can provide a presentation on that as well. So the last question I have here, and there seems to be some other comments about Montgomery County's water sources, but obviously that's a whole, we could get into that. Judy mentions Potomac comes from the Algonquian language and means where something is brought. And she mentions that she talks about that in her Potomac book, which you could purchase on the Montgomery History website. If you have questions about that, certainly reach out to me and we can get you a copy of that. She did put together a fantastic book on the history of Potomac. All right, well, I think, oh yeah, the last question here was when was the rock quarry near Seneca Rocks and Riley's Lock on the Maryland side used, or when was it active?
It was active. It was used to build the locks. If you go over to the Virginia side, it was used to build the locks on the Potomac Canal, and they're still there at Great Falls. And then I think it was shut down around in the early 20th century when they ran out. As I understand it, the benefit of that sandstone is it's fairly soft in the ground and therefore easy to cut. But when you expose it to the elements, it turns into a very hard rock, which is unusual for sandstone. And that's why it was so valuable, and the Smithsonian is built with it.
Okay. And then just the last question that popped up here, what was the name of the person at the park who knew about the quarry? And that is Eric Ledbetter. And I'm going to reach out to him because he might be a great source for a presentation. So stay tuned on that. Jim, I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Do you have any closing thoughts or comments here?
I only want to emphasize again that, I looked at this as the Potomac as this waterway and how as a waterway, it influenced history so much. And I want to focus on how it influenced our history too. And I hope people got that with it. But mainly, I want people to go out in the river and sort of experience it for themselves along the towpath or wherever.
Okay, well, as Jim mentioned earlier, there is a handout for this presentation, and we will have that on our website when we post the recording, which will be next Monday. And you can find that at montgomeryhistory.org /mhconnected/watch. And if you're on our mailing list, we send out emails, reminders every Monday for upcoming presentations, and we do put a link to that page in our email. So keep an eye out for that, and we'll get that up Monday morning. And Jim, just lots of thank yous and appreciation, lots of appreciation. So I will echo that and say thank you so much, and hope everyone gets a chance to get outside. And we'll see you next Wednesday evening at 7:30. So thanks again, Jim, and we'll talk to you later.
Okay.
All right. Bye.
Bye.